Okay, so you should be, let's take a look at where you've come from and where we're headed. At this point, you should have already completed number 1, where you looked up, asked your classmates for, and thought of lots of different ideas for what you might be writing about. So now that means we're at number 2 here, which is to study what makes a good piece of writing. And of course, this depends on the type of composition you're going to write. But we already know you're going to write a narrative, which is a story, okay? It could be a fictional story, or it could be a true story of something that happened to you. So by now you should have at least, I would say, 8 or 9 ideas of what you might be willing to write about. So let's study something that you may have studied before called the plot pyramid. We're going to study the plot structure components because basically every story in some form or another follows this kind of structure because it just makes sense to our brain. So it's important that the story has all of these elements, for one thing, so that it makes sense to us, and also so that it's interesting, which of course you want your story to be interesting. So as you watch this and as you listen, you can pause this as much as you need to so that you can take notes, okay? So the very beginning of a story is exposition. Exposition is the start of the story, and it's basically the way things are before any action starts. So it's kind of setting the stage. So a lot of times here you have descriptions of the characters, okay, and descriptions of the setting, and kind of an explanation of what's going on in the beginning, again, before any real action starts. So you could be writing a personal narrative, you could be writing a story about yourself, in which case you yourself would be a character in your own story. So of course you're going to want to give your reader a description of yourself, okay? Interesting tidbits about yourself that sets the stage, information that your reader needs to know about you or any other character in your story in order for your story to make sense to them and be interesting to them. Those are kind of the two things you're always going to ask yourself as you're writing. Does this help the story make sense? And does it help the story become more interesting? So the exposition is the very beginning of every story. And what would come next then? Next is what we call the rising action. And as it says here, this is a series of conflicts and crises in the story that leads to the climax. Well, we haven't discussed the climax yet, but we will in a moment. But the rising action is when things start to happen. In fact, it doesn't say so here, but a lot of times right here where I have my mouse would be what we call an inciting incident. So the first bit of action that happens, and then the rising action is everything that leads up to, as this is here, the climax. So let's take a look at the climax so that the definition of rising action makes more sense to you. The climax is the turning point of the story. A lot of times you hear it termed the point of no return. It also says here it's the most intense moment, which doesn't mean necessarily tons of action. It could be mentally very intense, okay? But what we mean by the point of no return means that things are going to be different after that point. So something major happens to a character that changes them, most likely, physically or mentally, most often. So with that in mind, we can look back at the rising action and know that the rising action is everything that happens that leads up to that moment. So you're definitely going to want to focus on what climax is when you are writing your own story. You need to start writing with your climax in mind because it is the most important part of the story. Everything leads to that moment. That's the moment where if you're writing about yourself, or maybe something huge happened to you that perhaps changed your life, okay, or changed the way you saw things from then on. So you always want to start writing with your climax in mind, so you know what you're leading up to, okay? That way you know what information your reader needs to know in your exposition, and you need to know what events would lead up to that so that you include all of that in your story. A lot of times young writers sit down and they're not thinking with the reader in mind, and so their story might not actually make a lot of sense to somebody who doesn't know anything about the story. So you always want to keep your reader in mind while you're writing. What does this person need to know, and what will keep it interesting for them? So what happens after the climax? Well, that's where we have our falling action. And that's any action that happens in the story after the climax, okay? And the next video will give you some examples that you can look at and try to match to this. But basically, in a word, it's everything that happens after the climax in the story. Well, then what could be left if the falling action is that? That's the resolution. And I like to think of the resolution as a lot of times when you're writing a narrative, probably it's going to be some sort of statement of the theme or the lesson learned. What's the greater connection to life that your reader can make based on your story? You don't have to come right out and say the moral of the story is, which probably when you were in elementary school or most likely elementary school, you read or heard some stories that did that at the end, that told you what lesson you were supposed to learn. As you become a more mature reader and writer, stories aren't going to come right out necessarily and spell it out for you that way, and so you probably won't do that in your own story, but you want to give your reader some sense of how things are now. As it says here, it's the tying together of all the threads. And that's going to look a little bit different in different stories. So we'll talk further about what that and all of these elements looks like in a story that probably everybody is familiar with.